Once again, a police officer has been invited onto a BBC show to declare that child abuse gangs are not primarily comprised of men of Pakistani origin, but if you examine both that excerpt and the data presented as a basis for it closely, the argument quickly falls apart. First, the set of figures used comes only from the year 2024, meaning it does not represent a comprehensive or historical view of the problem. Even more worrying, in less than a third of the cases recorded that year, information on the ethnic origin of the suspects was included. With such an incomplete database, making sweeping statements is, at the very least, reckless. The truth is that when reviewing broader studies and previous reports, a constant emerges that cannot be ignored. Pakistani men have a rate of participation in this type of crimes that reaches up to 5 times greater compared to the rest of the general population. This is a clear, statistically significant overrepresentation that any honest analysis should acknowledge. In this content, we are going to break down how certain media and spokespersons are reframing the narrative to soften or divert attention from the true scope of this scandal, one of the most serious and persistent the United Kingdom has faced in recent years. This is not a question of prejudice or simplification, it's a question of evidence and responsible reporting. Figures were presented that, although new, have obvious limitations. The child exploitation group provided recent data indicating that in 2024, gang sexual abuse against minors, specifically those associated with so-called grooming gangs, accounted for 17% of all reported gang child abuse offenses. And while ethnic diversity was reported among suspects, the proportion of individuals of Pakistani origin remains notable among the cases where ethnicity was recorded. In a nation where approximately 1 in every 40 inhabitants is of Pakistani origin, it is revealing that 1 in 8 suspects whose ethnicity is known in these cases belongs to that demographic group. This difference cannot be ignored or attributed solely to recording bias or statistical errors. Police authorities admit that the phenomenon of child sexual exploitation takes different forms and is not limited to a single profile. However, the data continues to point to a trend that requires specific attention without institutional overlays. Despite well-intentioned statements about improved protocols and collaborative work with child protection agencies, the problem persists. Official statements try to give an image of evolution and vigilance, but at the same time, the discussion about the overrepresentation of certain groups in these networks. It's true that there are multiple factors behind any criminal phenomenon, cultural, social, economic, but denying identifiable patterns only hinders an effective solution. Furthermore, the insistence of some media outlets on emphasizing that more than half of the registered suspects are white British may sound reassuring to certain sectors, but it fails to take into account the demographic context or the actual proportion within the general population. This is not about criminalizing a community, but about recognizing that there are repetitive patterns that must be addressed seriously. Ignoring them, downplaying their presence, or covering them up with politically correct rhetoric only deepens public distrust and perpetuates impunity. The most worrying thing is that, instead of opening the debate honestly, the choice has been made to shield certain narratives behind isolated figures and partial studies. This strategy not only offends the victims and their families, but undermines the credibility of the system, judicial, and protection agencies. As long as we avoid speaking clearly about the facts, gray areas where criminals operate with an advantage will continue to exist. Do you think the media is presenting the complete story or softening the reality? Is it fair to point out the overrepresentation of an ethnic group when the data shows it? What should be prioritized, political correctness or the real protection of minors? Have you noticed a change in how this topic is being covered in the news or on social media? On the other hand, on a completely different front, as the controversy over portrayals on abuse networks continues to generate public outrage, another issue has begun to rise up the UK political agenda: Prime Minister Keir Starmer's national defence plans. Although presented with solemnity and determination, these announcements have been quickly overshadowed by a fundamental question: where will the money come from to pay for it all? The proposal, described as a shift towards a war-ready Britain, proposes an unprecedented buildup of the armed forces. The British Army would grow for the first time in a generation, surpassing 76,000 active soldiers, and defense spending would increase to reach 3% of GDP in 2034. The Strategic Defense Review, which accompanies this plan, describes a new era of global threats that require real, not just symbolic, war preparation. But the concern is not in the diagnosis, but in the bill. Although Starmer insists that all the targets will be met, several economists and figures within his own party have warned that these promises do not add up without significant tax increases or painful cuts in other areas, such as the social welfare system. Some, like Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, have been categorical. If we really want to meet that level of spending, substantial tax increases will have to be implemented. The warnings aren't just coming from independent economists. Key figures within the Labour Party itself have begun to express reservations, with increasingly pronounced voices. Jack Straw, former British Foreign Secretary, was clear. "I see no other option but to raise taxes if this project is to be financed. There is no way out." And it's not just taxes that are being talked about. The need to serious cuts in sensitive items such as social security budgets and public aid. That is, the military effort could involve sacrificing resources intended for the most vulnerable sectors. Despite doubts, the Secretary of Defense John Healey has publicly maintained that he is 100% convinced that the money will be raised, although in the same statement avoided committing to a specific guarantee. His response was evasive. "We will never promise an increase in spending without first explaining how we are going to finance it," which, in fact, left the door open to future tax increase that has not yet been formally revealed to the electorate. For its part, Lord Robertson de Portelain, also a former defense minister and author of the Strategic Review, was more direct, stating that if the country wants to be truly prepared for the conflicts ahead, then the population will have to pay the price for that security. This message clashes with the optimistic rhetoric Starmer has attempted to maintain, creating a gap between political rhetoric and the harsh fiscal reality ahead. On the other side of the political spectrum, criticism has not been long in coming. The conservative James Cleverly, former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, harshly questioned the pace of implementation of the reform. "If we are facing a historic and decisive moment, why move so slowly? Why so timidly?" According to him, the plan points in the right direction, but it is guilty of being too cautious for the seriousness of the current scenario. What seems clear is that the debate does not revolve only around the need to modernize the armed forces, but also about the coherence between promises and the state's real capacity to fulfill them. Between mixed messages, incomplete estimates, and awkward silences, the population is beginning to wonder whether this project of an armored nation is a viable vision or simply an electoral promise with feet of clay. In short, the defense plan presented by Keir Starmer sets out an ambitious vision of a militarily strengthened Britain ready to face the challenges of the future. However, the lack of clarity about its funding, warnings from experts, and contradictions within the Labour Party itself make many wonder if we are not facing a promise motivated more by political interests than by realistic and responsible planning. At a time when every pound counts and economic pressure hits millions of British households, is this really the time to redesign the military at the cost of possible social cuts or tax increases? The intention to protect the country is not questioned, but the form and cost of that protection, yes, and that's something the people have the right to discuss with all the information on the table. Moreover, there's growing unease about how this defense agenda fits into the broader priorities of the nation. With the NHS still struggling post-pandemic, school infrastructure in decline, and local councils declaring effective bankruptcy, many citizens are asking whether military expansion should be the focus right now. In town halls and social media threads alike, the question reverberates: can a war-ready Britain afford to neglect its internal battles? Those of health, housing, and education. Critics argue that national security starts at home, and no number of tanks or jets will compensate for a crumbling welfare state. Adding to the tension is the perception that the government is pushing forward without a mandate. While Starmer touts this as a long-term strategic necessity, no such sweeping military vision was part of Labour's core message during the last general election. That disconnect is fueling suspicions that this is more about global positioning and transatlantic alignment than about responding to the British people's immediate needs. In a climate of economic strain and political skepticism, this plan may very well test not just the nation's finances, but the public's patience. What do you think? Do you think this increase in military spending is necessary, or do you think there are other, more pressing priorities? Would you be willing to pay more taxes if it guaranteed a stronger national defense? Are you convinced by the way the government is communicating and justifying this project? Do you think these proposals have a real basis, or are they more a response to electoral interests? Leave me your answers in the comments. I want to read your point of view, and if you are interested in these unfiltered analyses, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on upcoming topics that traditional media often prefers to ignore.